From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Do you want Rex Tillerson on the job, Mr. President?
He's here. Rex is here.
He's here. Do you want him to stay in his job?
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Will President Trump replace Secretary of State Rex Tillerson with CIA Director Mike Pompeo, then, according to the New York Times, pick Cotton? That's Republican Senator Tom Cotton to replace Pompeo at the CIA. We'll speak with national security reporter Marcy Wheeler, who says Trump may well end up firing Tillerson, but it's unlikely Pompeo will be approved or that Republicans can afford to defend Cotton's seat. Then the Senate could vote on the Republican tax plan as early as today. We'll look at a little-known provision tucked into the bill that would open one of the world's last pristine wildernesses, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, to oil and fracked gas drilling. We'll get response from photographer Subhankar Banerjee, editor of Arctic Voices, Resistance at the Tipping Point.
And for me, it's also a great human rights issue because its right to survival is one of the first rights people should have. Access to their food, access to their water, and that's being seriously threatened up in the Arctic.
Then a new investigation found strong evidence that U.S. Special Operations Forces massacred 10 unarmed civilians in Somalia, despite Pentagon claims they were armed enemy combatants.
American forces attacked us in our farms and killed these people, including children. Those killed were farmers who were innocent and not al-Shabaab fighters.
We'll speak with journalist Christina Goldbaum, based in Mogadishu, Somalia. And we'll get an update on the Impeach Trump movement. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. On Capitol Hill, the Senate could vote as early as today on a Republican tax plan that would shower billions of dollars in tax cuts on the richest Americans and corporations. But their efforts have hit a snafu when the nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation said the bill would add $1 trillion to federal budget deficits over the next decade. Its report directly contradicts claims made by Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, who's repeatedly claimed the tax cuts would pay for themselves by stimulating the economy. Mnuchin had promised to release a Treasury Department analysis backing his claims, but he's yet to release any data, and Treasury officials at the Office of Tax Policy told the New York Times they haven't been tasked with researching the bill's impacts. On Thursday, the tax plan got a major boost when Arizona Republican Senator John McCain said he'd vote in favor of the bill. Critics say the tax cuts could trigger billions of dollars in cuts to Medicare, including cutting off access to chemotherapy and other cancer treatments. Senator McCain's support for the bill came a day after his doctor said they discovered a second tumor in his brain. Meanwhile, a little-known provision within the Republican tax bill would open one of the world's last pristine wildernesses, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, to oil and fracked gas drilling. We'll have more on that provision later in the broadcast. The White House Thursday denied reports that Chief of Staff John Kelly has developed a plan to push Secretary of State Rex Tillerson out of his role and replace him with CIA Director Mike Pompeo. According to the New York Times, President Trump would then pick Cotton, that's Republican Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas, to replace Pompeo at the CIA. Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders denied the reports but refused to say whether Trump has confidence in Tillerson. At the White House, Trump did little to quell speculation over Tillerson's future after briefly answering reporters' questions during a photo op with Bahrain's Crown Prince.
Do you want Rex Tillerson on the job, Mr. President?
He's here. Rex is here.
He's here. Do you want him to stay in his job?
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
More than 100 senior Foreign Service officers have left the State Department since President Trump took office in what appears to be a forced exodus carried out by the Secretary of State, Tillerson. We'll have more on the chaos at the State Department after headlines with national security reporter Marcy Wheeler. A top congressional Democrat said Thursday Senator Al Franken should resign after 2 more women accused Franken of unwanted sexual contact. In one of the new allegations, Army veteran Stephanie Kemplin says Franken cupped her breast at a USO event in 2003 as the pair posed for a photo, refusing to let go. The allegation came 2 weeks after radio broadcaster Leanne Tweeden posted a photo showing Franken appearing to place his hands on her breasts over her Kevlar vest while she was sleeping on a plane in 2006 as they they were both coming back from a USO tour. On Thursday, Congressmember Joe Crowley of New York, the chair of the House Democratic Caucus, said Franken should leave the Senate. Meanwhile, in Detroit, Michigan, Democratic Congressmember John Conyers has been hospitalized in what aides call a stress-related illness brought on by multiple accusations he sexually harassed or groped women, charges he denies. On Thursday, House Democratic Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi said Conyers should resign.
The brave women who came forward are owed justice. I pray for Congressman Conyers and his family and wish them well. However, Congressman Conyers should resign.
On Thursday, the woman who settled a sexual misconduct case against Conyers spoke publicly for the first time about her ordeal. Marion Brown said Congressman Conyers invited her to a Chicago hotel room in 2005 where he appeared in his underwear and demanded she touch him sexually. She says she was fired when she refused. Speaking on NBC's Today Show, Brown acknowledged she broke a confidentiality agreement to come forward.
I am taking a risk, and the reason why I'm taking a risk, it is important I want to be a voice. You know, my ancestors, my grandmother, you know, my mother, my daughters, you know, my granddaughter. You know, I want her, when she enters the workforce, long when I'm gone, I want her to not have to, you know, endure sexism and gender inequality. And I want to stand up, and I felt it was worth the risk to stand up for all the women in the workforce that are voiceless, you know, that ordinary women like myself with extraordinary challenges working in the workforce that are dominated by men.
Marion Brown was speaking with Today's Show host Savannah Guthrie. In the last 14 months, the program has fired 2 of its male anchors over sexual misconduct. In October of 2016, NBC fired Billy Bush after he was heard in a 2005 tape laughing and egging on Donald Trump as Trump boasted about sexually assaulting women. And on Tuesday, NBC fired its longtime Today host, Matt Lauer, over multiple accusations of sexual harassment and assault. On Thursday, Lauer offered a qualified apology, saying, quote, "There are no words to express my sorrow and regret for the pain I've caused others by words and actions. Some of what is being said about me is untrue or mischaracterized, but there's enough truth in these stories to make me feel embarrassed and ashamed," he said. The New York Times reports one former NBC employee was summoned by Lauer to his office in 2001, where Lauer allegedly locked the door and sexually assaulted her until she passed out. In Alabama, Republican U.S. Senate candidate Roy Moore blamed the LGBT community, liberals and socialists, for undermining his campaign after multiple women said he sexually harassed or assaulted them as teenagers, one as young as 14. Moore was speaking from the pulpit at a campaign event in a church in the city of Theodore on Wednesday night.
They're liberals. They don't want conservative values. They're the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender who want to change our culture. They're socialists who want to change our way of life, putting man above God, and that government is our God.
After late-night talk show host Jimmy Kimmel sent a comedian to Moore's event, Moore tweeted, "Jimmy Kimmel, if you want to mock our Christian values, come down here to Alabama and do it man to man." Kimmel responded, quote, "Sounds great, Roy. Let me know when you get some Christian values, and I'll be there." After Moore offered to save a pew for Kimmel, the comedian replied, "Okay, Roy, but I'm leaving my daughters at home." Meanwhile, the White House said Thursday President Trump will hold a rally in the Florida Panhandle next week, 4 days ahead of Alabama's special election. Pensacola is just 20 miles from the Alabama border, and it's in the same media market as Mobile, Alabama. Music mogul Russell Simmons stepped down from his companies Thursday after a second woman charged him with sexual assault. Screenwriter Jenny Lumet says Simmons forced her into his apartment in 1991 and raped her. Meanwhile, the Gloucester Stage Company has severed its ties with playwright Israel Horovitz after the New York Times reported at least 9 women have accused him of sexual harassment, assault, or rape. Israel Horovitz is the father of Beastie Boys co-founder Adam Horovitz, who told the New York Times, quote, "I believe the allegations against my father are true, and I stand behind the women that made them." In Honduras, at least one protester was killed and scores injured as police fired tear gas and charged demonstrators outside the country's electoral commission in the capital, Tegucigalpa. The protest came as the commission continued its delay in declaring a winner in Sunday's election after early returns showed progressive candidate Salvador Nasrallah with a significant lead. On Thursday, the commission said U.S.-backed incumbent President Juan Orlando Hernandez had edged ahead of Nasrallah with over 90% of the votes counted, prompting Nasrallah and his supporters to charge the Electoral Commission with vote rigging. The Pentagon said on Thursday that U.S.-led airstrikes in Iraq and Syria have killed at least 800 civilians since the launch of a war against ISIS in 2014. The military's figure is vastly lower than estimates from human rights observers, including Amnesty International. The journalistic monitoring group Air Wars says it's documented at least 5,961 civilians killed in Iraq and Syria by U.S.-led coalition attacks aimed at ISIS. In Pakistan, at least 9 people were killed today after gunmen disguised as women in burqas stormed an agricultural college in the northern city of Peshawar, opening fire on students and workers. The Pakistani Taliban has claimed responsibility for the attack, which also left 36 people injured. In Yemen, tens of thousands of people rallied in the capital Sana'a on Thursday, calling for an end to the U.S.-backed Saudi-led bombing campaign and blockade. The protests came as the aid group Save the Children said at least 130 children are dying each day from extreme hunger and disease brought on by the war. Back in the United States, an undocumented immigrant at the center of the high-profile murder trial used by President Trump to attack sanctuary cities has been acquitted of murder and manslaughter. Jose Inez Garcia Zarate was charged in the July 2015 killing of Kate Steinle on a San Francisco pier. He was in the United States after he'd been deported to Mexico 5 times since first entering the United States as a juvenile. His attorneys argued he found the gun and it accidentally discharged, with the bullet ricocheting off the ground before striking Steinle. President Trump reacted on Twitter, calling the verdict disgraceful. In Arizona, a Border Patrol agent shot and killed an undocumented migrant in a remote mountainous region on the Tohono O'odham Nation on Wednesday. The shooting occurred about 20 miles away from the U.S.-Mexico border. The chief of the U.S. Border Patrol's Tucson sector is claiming without evidence that the shooting occurred after the man grabbed the gun of one of the agents. Migrant justice groups are demanding the killing be investigated. And in the Philippines' capital, Manila, police opened fire with water cannons on more than 1,000 activists Thursday as they marched to the presidential palace demanding the resignation of President Rodrigo Duterte. The activists blasted Duterte for welcoming President Trump to the Philippines last month and say he's presided over a bloody so-called war on drugs that's seen police and vigilantes carry out more than 7,000 extrajudicial killings. This is protester Vencer Crisostomo.
We will not allow Duterte to install himself as a dictator. We have had dictators before, and they were ousted.
Those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show with reports that White House Chief of Staff John Kelly has developed a plan to push Secretary of State Rex Tillerson out of his role and replace him with CIA Director Mike Pompeo. The New York Times reports President Trump would then pick Cotton, that's Republican Senator Tom Cotton, to replace Pompeo at the CIA. Cotton has been a key ally of the president on national security matters. White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders denied the reports Thursday, as did State Department spokesperson Heather Nauert.
Here's what I know. I don't work at the White House, but what I can tell you is that that Chief of Staff Kelly called our department this morning and said that the rumors are not true, that those reports are not true. He remains, as I have been told, committed to doing this job. He does serve at the pleasure of the president. This is a job that he enjoys. He's continuing with his meetings. He's continuing with his calls. He has spoken not only with Foreign Minister Gabriel, but also with the UN Secretary General earlier today. And so he's continuing with a full schedule.
President Trump did little to indicate he has confidence in Tillerson. After posing for photographs with the Bahraini Crown Prince Salman bin Hamad Al Khalifa at the White House, reporters asked Trump about his plans to replace Tillerson.
Do you want Rex Tillerson on the job, Mr. President?
He's here. Rex is here.
He's here. Do you want him to stay in his job?
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Tillerson's tenure at the State Department has been rocky. He's been criticized for dramatically downsizing the department and gutting the diplomatic corps. More than 100 senior Foreign Service officers have left the State Department since President Trump took office in what appears to be a forced exodus carried out by Tillerson. Tensions between the president and the Secretary of State has spilled over to U.S. foreign policy. In October, Trump publicly undermined efforts at diplomacy with North Korea initiated by the State Department after Tillerson said the U.S. had 2 or 3 channels open to North Korea's leadership and he was pursuing dialogue. Trump responded by tweeting, "I told Rex Tillerson, our wonderful Secretary of State, that he's wasting his time trying to negotiate with little rocket man. Save your energy, Rex. We'll do what has to be done," Trump tweeted. Tensions also flared between the two after reports that Tillerson had called Trump, quote, "an effing moron" during an NBC interview. Trump responded in an interview with Forbes magazine saying, quote, "If he did that, I guess we'll have to compare IQ tests." Well, for more, we're joined in Grand Rapids, Michigan, by Marcy Wheeler, an independent journalist who covers national security and civil liberties, runs the website emptywheel.net. Her latest piece, headlined "Throwing H2O on the Pompeo to State Move." Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Marcy. Okay, lay out what you understand is happening with Tillerson summoned to the White House yesterday.
Well, the claim is that Tillerson is going to be ousted and Mike Pompeo, who's currently in charge of the CIA, will be moved over to the State Department. And then Tom Cotton, who is a senator who's on the Senate Intelligence Committee, he would replace Pompeo at CIA. And that would have the effect of taking somebody who's terrible at the State Department, but still better than Pompeo, and putting in 2 very similar people. Pompeo and Cotton are both pro-torture, pro-Gitmo. They've both talked about prosecuting journalists. And very importantly, and I think this is the key issue, they are both willing to politicize the intelligence on Iran in order to support a more belligerent stance against Iran. And I sort of think that's what this is mostly about, is, as you said, Tillerson has tried to keep diplomatic channels open with North Korea, but he's also said that Iran is complying with the agreement that Obama put into place. And both Pompeo and Cotton have made efforts to deny that. And so this, to me, feels like an effort to get real Iran hawks in both of those positions, state and CIA.
This is Senator Tom Cotton expressing his views on waterboarding during an interview on CNN.
Well, waterboarding isn't torture. We do waterboarding to our own soldiers in the military.
That's in training, but the U.S. doesn't do it anymore. They've stopped.
But we've done it in the past.
And do you think the U.S. should do it again?
And radio DJs volunteer for it. So I don't think something people volunteer for is torture.
So you accept waterboarding?
If experienced intelligence professionals come to the President of the United States and say, we think this terrorist has critical information and we need to obtain it, and this is the only way we can obtain it, that's a tough call. But the presidency is a tough job, and if you're not willing to make those tough calls, then you shouldn't seek the office.
The Army Field Manual, which instructs interrogators, interrogations by U.S. officials, prohibits cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, waterboarding one of the 8 techniques of interrogation expressly prohibited from being used in the field. Marcy Wheeler.
Right, and as I said, Pompeo has also supported torture and thwarted the publication of the torture report. So you have there 2 people, plus Trump, because he, of course, came out in favor of torture on the campaign, who have affirmatively said that they would welcome the return to the use of torture that we had under the Bush administration. So that would be a big part of it, and CIA, of course, would be probably in charge of it again, and we'd be back down that route of really counterproductive programs of trying to get intelligence from terrorist suspects and others.
And talk about the significance of moving the CIA director to the State Department. And then, again, Rex Tillerson, former head of the largest oil corporation in the world, ExxonMobil, as head of state. They talk about reorganizing, but it's just a massive gutting of the department. But it's not as if he's not doing that for the President of the United States, that wasn't the express intent that whoever is there would be doing.
And there's no reason to believe Pompeo would do a better job. A couple of the things that Pompeo has been accused of at CIA is bringing religion into public events at the CIA, Cotton would probably continue those at CIA, but Pompeo would do the same, presumably at State. He has de-emphasized diversity, really important at both CIA and State Department. We would assume that he would continue to do that there. So it's, you know, there's no reason at all to believe that Mike Pompeo would start rebuilding the State Department in a way that we would need to happen. As I said, I think this is really about policy and really about especially Iran.
So what's happening now with Tillerson is this massive shaming that Trump is engaging in, right? He answers the reporters yesterday, are you going to fire him, by saying Rex is here. He's brought into the White House, but he won't answer whether he has confidence in him or whether he's firing him.
And this is really similar to what we saw during the summer with Jeff Sessions, right? The reports were that Sessions was going to be fired. Trump did very, very similar things, shaming Sessions publicly. And as a result, Sessions started moving towards opening an investigation into Hillary Clinton again on the Uranium One thing. And I think that this is a very similar tactic, which is that Trump, his management style is to shame and humiliate his subordinates and do that as a way to get them back on the policies that he wants. I mean, he shouldn't have that much control over cabinet officials, but this is his way of exercising control. And that's my bet, is that he is trying to get Tillerson into a far more belligerent stance versus Iran and North Korea and other things than he thinks is smart. And he's using the press to do that. That's at least my read of it.
On Thursday, the New York Times reported President Trump pressured senior Senate Republicans over the summer, including the chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, to drop Mueller's probe into alleged ties between the Trump campaign and Russia. News coming amidst reports that Mueller's investigators recently questioned senior White House advisor and Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, over a meeting with a Russian ambassador during the presidential transition.
Right, and this is actually one of the reasons why this switch isn't going to happen, because I don't think Pompeo is confirmable by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, because we've learned a lot more of his implication in the Russian story. The Kushner meeting was reported as kind of one of the last things that Mueller had to put into place before this plea agreement that people have been talking about with Mike Flynn. And that suggests that there's more news about to drop regarding Mike Flynn that I think is going to really dramatically change how Republicans take the Russian investigation. Somehow, you know, Flynn had been avoiding discussing plea agreements for months and months and months, and then really in the last 2 weeks, all of a sudden it seems like it's about to happen. Mueller has more leverage over Flynn in the last couple of weeks. It may be Turkey, because a key witness in New York has turned state's evidence and apparently has information on Flynn. I think there's some other information. And so Flynn, we expect, is moving towards a plea agreement. I expect that's going to add a lot more pressure on Trump. And I've been saying for months that the way to get to Kushner is through Flynn, because a lot of the events in which Flynn was involved, such as meeting with Sergei Kislyak in December, they connect very closely with activities that Kushner is known to be involved with. So that seems to be where things are moving. And you know, this Pompeo news seems impossible against that background, because Pompeo has helped Trump to cover up this Russia thing. And I don't see Bob Corker and I don't see Marco Rubio, who are both Senate Foreign Relations Committee members, I don't see them supporting Pompeo having an even bigger role in the administration as this Russia stuff kind of opens up.
And Flynn and Turkey, can you explain what's been uncovered at this point?
So Flynn was a consultant for the Turkish government, but through some cutouts, right? And he is alleged to have discussed on 2 different occasions, basically kidnapping a cleric who lives in Pennsylvania that the Turkish government considers one of their big enemies. They blame him for the attempted coup earlier the year. So that's one thing, is that he has talked about kidnapping an American permanent resident on behalf of another government. The other thing is that there was a guy named Reza Zarrab who was charged in a sanctions avoidance laundering case in New York, basically laundering money to get gold to Iran. That connects very closely with Turkey's president, but that guy, Zarrab, made a plea agreement, basically, and that just came out this week. The trial in which he is testifying is rolling out, but he is believed to have some information about Flynn's efforts to free him on behalf of the Turkish government. And again, this is another case where Flynn didn't disclose these monies. He was working as the Transition National Security Advisor and being paid by a foreign government. There's a much stronger case against him on this Turkish stuff, even than on the Russian stuff. And so I think not only is it easier to charge him with this stuff, and that would be kind of similar to what happened to Paul Manafort, but also one of the things that has been reported to happen is it would implicate his son, Mike Flynn Jr., who was involved in some of these things. And so one of the motives that Flynn might have for cooperating with Mueller is to keep his son out of prison.
And finally, do you think this could account for all these developments this week, could account for the further unraveling of President Trump, right? Tweeting out these racist, Islamophobic videos, talking about, President Obama once again, as he led the birther movement, Trump did, and all of the things he's done, the Pocahontas comments in the midst of a Navajo code talker ceremony in the Oval Office in front of a portrait of President Andrew Jackson, but all of this coming one after the other has Republicans scratching their heads as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to measure the next outrage from the president, but I do think that he's hearing footsteps. I do think he continues to try and convince those around him that he's not at any risk of this investigation. That's ridiculous at this point. It's clear that Mueller is investigating him for obstruction, if not far more, and these attempts to distract attention, but I also think, and this will segue into your next piece, but I also think he's also attempting to distract from the fact that he's about to, in the name of tax reform, carry out this vast looting of the American poor and middle class. So, it serves two purposes: distract from Russia, but also distract from the tax bill that they're rushing through Congress this week.
Well, Marcy Willer, I want to thank you so much for being with us. Independent journalist who covers national security and civil liberties, runs the website emptywheel.net. We'll link to your piece, Throwing Water on the Pompeo to State Move. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we go to Albuquerque, New Mexico, to talk about a little-known provision of the tax law that has to do with opening up the Arctic to drilling. And then we will go to Mogadishu. We'll talk about the latest on a massacre that took place there. What was the U.S. involvement? And finally, we'll look at the impeach Trump movement. Stay with us.
Hundreds of miles, yeah, you cry like a baby. You plead with me, shout, scream, tell me I'm staying. I know, I know, I know, I'm still your love. Back from the last place that I wanted to fake. You laugh with me, shout, scream, now tell me you're staying. I know, I know, I know, you're still my love. The same as I love you, you'll always love me too. This love isn't gonna last. It's me and you.
I know. Tegan and Sarah here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Senate could vote as early as today on a Republican tax plan that would shower billions of dollars in tax cuts on the richest Americans and corporations. Tucked into the bill are amendments added during negotiations meant to win votes to pass the measure. One little-known provision would open one of the world's last pristine wildernesses, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, to oil and frack gas drilling. The Arctic Refuge is rich in biodiversity, home to caribou, polar bears, musk oxen. Millions of migratory birds gather there from across the world, and whales reside just offshore. It's also been home to generations of indigenous people for thousands of years. This is Gwich'in tribal government member Samuel Alexander testifying last month during a Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources hearing.
When we talk about the refuge, we talk about the land. It is tied to our language and our understanding of the world. And, you know, the Wadzai, the caribou, we are connected to them when we recognize that. You know, I hear this talk about development all the time. We need to develop this, we need to develop that. What I think we need is a little bit of understanding of the sustainability of the life that we live as Gwich'in, all right? We're not sitting here asking for anything. We're not saying we need hospitals, we need schools, we need all these things. We're not saying give us money. What we're saying is let us live as Gwich'in.
Legislation to allow drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge was quietly added to the Republican tax bill, meaning indigenous activists and environmentalists are now on the brink of losing their decades-long political battle over the refuge. Hundreds of scholars from dozens of universities have signed a letter to Congress that reads in part, quote, "The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge must not be auctioned off to big oil. Its natural values far exceed any oil that may lie beneath the coastal plain. As scholars from across the United States and Canada, we ask that you keep this cherished place and vibrant ecosystem protected for generations to come." Well, for more, we're going to Albuquerque, New Mexico, where we're joined by Subankar Banerjee, activist, photographer, and Lannan Chair and Professor of Art and Ecology at the University of New Mexico. His new piece for Tom Dispatch, headlined "Drilling, Drilling Everywhere. Will the Trump Administration Take Down the Arctic Refuge?" Subankar Banerjee is the author of Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, Seasons of Life and Land, and editor of Arctic Voices, Resistance at the Tipping Point. An exhibition of his Arctic work, Long Environmentalism in the Near North, is on display at the University of New Mexico Art Museum. Subankar Banerjee, welcome to Democracy Now! Tell us what's at stake and why what's at stake is hidden in the tax bill that could be voted on as early as today.
Indeed. Amy, thank you for giving voice to the Arctic Refuge and showing the segment of Gwich'in leader Sam Alexander during the Senate testimony. What we are talking about is epic crime about to be committed by the US Congress, and we need to stop this. And let me just preface this by saying that the most significant story on our planet right now is actually not even climate change, but the mass extinction and die-off of species with which we share this planet. Scientists have are telling us that we are in the midst of the 6th extinction. So what can we do? Of course, it's a very, very complicated issue. It's more complicated than even climate change. But the least we should do as an ethical imperative, global ethical imperative, is to not destroy vital birthing grounds and nurseries where animals replenish their populations. And when it comes to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, where drilling is proposed, the coastal plain of the Arctic Refuge is the biologically most diverse nursery, protected nursery in the entire circumpolar north. It is a nursery of global significance. And I'm not saying this sitting at a high tower of academia. I have spent enormous amount of time in all seasons in that coastal plain and have seen life being born, being nursed in all seasons, including winter. That is the coastal plain where the polar bear gives birth. That is the coastal plain where muskox gives birth. That is the coastal plain where 200,000 strong Porcupine River caribou herd that earlier Sam Alexander was talking about give birth and nurse their young. That is the coastal plain where millions of birds from 6 continents and all 50 United States go there to nest and rear their young. And I have experienced all of this personally out there. And the most beautiful way that the Arctic Refuge coastal plain is a nursing ground has been articulated by the indigenous Gwich'in people of Northeast Alaska and Northwest Canada. They call it in their language, Gwich'in language, Itzigwatsangwandai Goodlit, which roughly translates to, in English, the sacred place where life begins. So to turn the sacred place where life begins into an oil field at a time of extreme global climate change that George Monbiot calls climate breakdown, and in the midst of sixth extinction, is an epic crime.
So explain how this is being dealt with in the tax code, the tax bill today.
That is what I have called in my Tom Dispatch piece is a grand deception. For 4 decades, Alaska congressional delegation have used various techniques, including intimidation, lying, myths, and deception. And this is their latest attempt. This is not the first time. They have tried to sneak this as part of the budget reconciliation process. They tried this twice in the past. In '95, actually the bill passed, but President Bill Clinton vetoed it. And in 2005 again, they tried, but Senator Maria Cantwell's valiant effort actually stopped that process. And as well as large number of moderate Republicans on the House side defeated it in 2005. That's where we are right now, that they have snuck it in while the entire nation is focused on talking about a massive giveaway tax, they call it the tax cuts, giveaway to the corporations and the rich. And we are struggling with that. They have snuck the largest environmental justice campaign of this nation. It's been going on for 7 decades into this budget bill. So this is a grand deception that must be, the public should know about it, and really there should be an outrageous outcry. And you mentioned about the scholars letter. My colleague, historian Finis Dunaway in Trent University in Canada and I organized this. And quickly, within a day, we had 300 scholars from nearly 100 institutions across the United States and Canada signed up. So this is a grand deception that's going on. They have snuck this into the budget bill. It should be taken out of the budget bill immediately.
So Alaska congressional members and the Alaska governor have argued they need to open up new areas to oil development to help Alaska's struggling economy, which depends in large part on oil. Can you comment on this, Subhankar Banerjee?
Yes, so the way, I'll give a very brief history. Right after the World War II, entire north slope of Alaska, the Arctic Alaska, was actually was kept off limit to any kind of development through a public land order called Land Order 82. And so when after the Alaska became a state in 1959 and then 1960, Eisenhower administration, Secretary Fred Seaton struck a deal. It was a compromise that he created the Arctic Wildlife Range, which later President Jimmy Carter in 1980 made it into Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. But what Seaton did in 1960 was actually rescinded the Public Land Order 82 to give 20 million acres to state of Alaska, where Prudhoe Bay oil field development has been going on. And what Jimmy Carter did is he explicitly said that 95% of Arctic Alaska would be open for oil and gas development. What we are talking about is the last 5%, which is the coastal plain of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. So when state of Alaska is saying they need to open up, what they're saying is, we want it all. We can't have that. It's not possible. It's like legally not right, and it's ethically not right. There are other areas where recent discoveries of oil has happened on state land as well as federal land on the Western Arctic, where they are actually already developing. So the Arctic Refuge must remain off limits to development.
Subhankar Banerjee, if the Senate does pass the tax bill today and this is in it, is it also in the House bill? What happens next?
It is not in the House bill right now. So what will happen, it's very difficult to say what will happen, but a lot of things are rapidly, they're doing these things so fast. But let me just say this. First of all, Arctic refuge drilling is not in the budget part of the House bill, the tax budget bill. It is in the Senate. If they pass it today, it will be in the Senate, and what will happen is that they will have to do what is called a conference committee, or that's the normal procedure, regular order. They may or may not do that. That is the regular order. So they'll have to reconcile the differences between the two versions of the bill across the two chambers of Congress. During that time, there is an opportunity that there could be amendments introduced that could take out Arctic refuge drilling. And we are hoping that both Democratic and Republican lawmakers from the House and the Senate side will come to their senses and remove the Arctic refuge drilling. Beyond that, let's say it even passes and the budget goes to the president's office, President Trump will sign it. Beyond that, this is far from over, because this battle will go on for the next whole decade. Because what they are doing, they're likely violating various environmental laws. So the first thing that will happen will be legal lawsuits, and the environmental organizations and other attorneys are already looking at that. We will be fighting it on the ground. So because they are likely violating various different laws, I said, including the National Environmental Policy Act and other acts, by pushing this thing through a fast-track process. So all of that will be looked at very carefully. It's a campaign far from over. We'll be fighting this for the next decade.
Subhankar Banerjee, I want to thank you very much for being with us, Professor of Art and Ecology at the University of New Mexico, speaking to us from Albuquerque. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we'll talk about what happened in Somalia, U.S. involvement in a massacre that took place of Somali civilians. Stay with us. Guillotine, covered by Piano Dreamers here on Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. The Pentagon's on the defensive after a new investigation revealed evidence that U.S. Special Operations Forces massacred civilians in Somalia earlier this year, allegedly firing on unarmed farmers and their families, then planting weapons beside the bodies to appear as though the people were armed members of al-Shabaab. On Wednesday, the Pentagon released a statement that said, quote, after a thorough assessment of the Somali National Army-led operation near Bariere, Somalia on August 25, 2017, and the associated allegations of civilian casualties, U.S. Special Operations Command Africa has concluded that the only casualties were those of armed enemy combatants. This statement came after the Daily Beast published an investigation Wednesday on the Bariere operation and its aftermath and reported what eyewitnesses have said since the attack. The victims were farmers. They were killed by American soldiers, they said.
American forces attacked us in our farms and killed these people, including children. Those killed were farmers who were innocent and not al-Shabaab fighters.
In fact, after the attack, hundreds protested, and survivors refused to bury their dead until the Somali government apologized and withdrew allegations that they were members of al-Shabaab and reportedly paid the victims' families as much as $75,000 each. All of this comes as the U.S. recently revealed it has some 500 troops in Somalia, up from a reported 50 earlier this year. And on Thursday, the death toll reported from a massive truck bomb attack in Mogadishu in October rose from at least 350 to 512. For more, we're joined by Christina Goldbaum, independent journalist based in Mogadishu, Somalia. Today, she joins us from Nairobi, Kenya. Her new article in the Daily Beast is headlined, Strong Evidence That U.S. Special Operations Forces Massacred Civilians in Somalia. Christina, thanks so much for being with us. You interviewed several survivors, as well as the Somali Army commander in charge of the Somali soldiers who assisted in the operation, and also Somali intelligence officers, local leaders, and government officials familiar with this attack. Can you lay out what you found? What happened this past summer?
Yes, so as you said, after this operation happened, there was a big uproar in Somalia. People were protesting in a town nearby to where this happened. The families also refused to bury their dead until the Somali national government admitted that they were civilians, as you say. And so after that happened, I began looking into what exactly had happened in that operation. This investigation included over 24 interviews of people who knew about it and people who were eyewitnesses. And what I found is shocking in two ways. The first is that AFRICOM, or the U.S. Africa Command, often says that U.S. soldiers on the ground in Somalia and elsewhere in Africa are doing advise, assist, and now they're starting to say accompany missions. And they'll have the public believe that in the course of these operations, U.S. soldiers are not in the line of fire. They are simply advising and assisting local forces. And so the first thing that shocked me in the course of this investigation was learning that, in fact, U.S. soldiers who are part of this mission were on the front lines. They were firing, in addition to the Somali National Army soldiers, at these civilians. And we learned that from looking at the shell casings that were found and were immediately collected after this operation happened and immediately brought to Mogadishu, again, because these farmers are civilians, and they wanted to make that clear. So that, I think, is one thing that is very important to note, because, again, U.S. Africa Command will have the American public believe that U.S. soldiers are not in the line of fire, and this clearly demonstrates that that is not the case. The second kind of interesting fact about this is that Somalia is an incredibly complex environment. You have al-Shabaab militants in rural areas, but then you also have a lot of clans who have rivalries and are in conflict with each other. So you also have a lot of farmers, pastoralists who are armed to protect their resources, to protect their camels, to protect their farmland from rival clans and rival clan militias. And what became clear to me in the course of this investigation was that the U.S. special operators who had carried out this operation didn't quite understand that dynamic in the course of planning this operation. They had approached the Ugandan Defense Forces contingent commander as a part of the African Union peacekeeping force, and his purview includes Barire. And he had actually advised them against doing this mission. When he said that he would not offer his soldiers, they instead went to a Somali National Army brigade that had not been trained by U.S. soldiers, as some Somali National Army brigades have been. The U.S. is there training Danab, which is a special forces unit of the Somali National Army. So they approached the Somali National Army to help them with this operation. It became clear that they were getting information from that leader of that brigade of the Somali National Army, who is a former al-Shabaab commander. They were also getting information from a militia leader who is in direct rivalry to the clan of the farmers who were killed. And in addition to that, they were also using a translator who they had used in a different operation a year ago in central Somalia, in north-central Somalia, that had resulted in the death of 10 people who were not al-Shabaab. They were, in fact, from a local militia that the U.S. had been working alongside. And so it seems as if those three individuals in particular, perhaps others, had misled the U.S. forces, and that those U.S. forces had not sufficiently vetted the information that they were getting about who these farmers are. I also learned from talking to the farmers who had survived this operation that they had approached the Somali National Army commander multiple times in the week prior to this operation happening to let him know that they did have arms, but they were not al-Shabaab, that the arms that they had were to protect them from a rival clan who they believed were going to attack their farm. And they wanted to make clear to the American special operators they knew were now in this town nearby that they were simply farmers and they were armed, but that did not mean that they were al-Shabaab. And yet that information was clearly not conveyed to these U.S. special operators. And again, I don't think that the information that they were getting in the lead up to this operation had been sufficiently vetted. And again, if you read that AFRICOM statement that came out just after I published this investigation with the Daily Beast, they'll remind you that they take every precaution to try to protect civilian lives. And I would say that in this operation, that's not the case, that this information was not sufficiently vetted, which is why 10 farmers, including one child, was killed in the course of this operation.
So this happened, Christina Goldbaum, on August 25th, this past summer. Explain what the people did then with, well, what the soldiers did and which soldiers did this, laying weapons out next to the dead bodies.
Yes. Yes, so when the farmers approached the Somali National Army commander, he had instructed them, and he told local media this immediately after this incident, he had instructed them to place their weapons in a house. That way, that if there was drone surveillance, they wouldn't be confused for al-Shabaab because they wouldn't be carrying arms. So on those instructions, these farmers placed their weapons in a house as a part of this farming village. And after they were killed, after they were shot and the survivors were brought to the scene where some of their fellow farmers were shot, they saw the Somali National Army soldiers go into the house on the instruction of U.S. special operators, collect the weapons that had been inside that house, and then place them next to the bodies of the farmers who were killed. And then they saw the 3 U.S. special operators taking photos of their bodies. Now, it's important to note that usually if there's a firefight and a weapon is displaced, maybe it's thrown a foot or 2 away from an enemy who is killed, that it's not unusual for a soldier to take that weapon and place it next to the body of that person killed before taking a photo to demonstrate that they are an enemy combatant. However, these weapons were not displaced on the battlefield in the course of a firefight. These weapons were in a home on the instruction of the Somali National Army commander. And it seems to me, seeing the Somali National Army soldiers collect them from this house where they had been stashed and place them next to the weapons, it's directly misleading. Taking a picture of a farmer who was killed with a weapon that was in a house and he was not firing back in the course of this operation to try to prove that he is an al-Shabaab militant, that is directly misleading. And I think one thing that shocked me again in the course of this investigation is the seemingly kind of cover-up of what happened, from placing these weapons next to the bodies to diplomats in Mogadishu pressuring the Somali government to hide the findings of their own investigation into this incident, which proved that these people were civilians. And because of that investigation, because the Somali government knows that they are civilians, that's why they paid these families at least $70,000 in the aftermath. And they would never do that if these people were al-Shabaab militants.
So the amount of money you're talking about each family got something like $70,000. Where did the money come from?
I talked to a number of government officials who gave me the figure between $60,000 and $70,000. At least one of those government officials believed that that money is actually coming from the United States. That's only one person. I haven't confirmed that, but that is his strong belief that part of, again, in the aftermath of this, part of the U.S. diplomats pressuring the Somali government to not publish the findings in their investigation was kind of quietly paying these families as compensation for what happened. Again, that's one source, but it is clear that at least that these families were paid in the aftermath of this event, which again would never happen if they were al-Shabaab combatants. You would never have protests like you did if they were al-Shabaab combatants, and you would never have al-Shabaab bringing the bodies of those killed to Mogadishu and refusing to bury them if they were al-Shabaab. That would be absolutely unprecedented, and I can't see any reason why al-Shabaab would do so.
And the idea that the villagers took the bodies of the dead to Mogadishu to prove that they were civilians, that they were not al-Shabaab, Christina?
Exactly. I mean, again, there has never been any incident in Somalia where al-Shabaab brought their own militants to Mogadishu and refused to bury them. That would be absolutely unprecedented, and I cannot see any reason why al-Shabaab would do that. The reason that this happened, the elders of this particular clan were, again, pressuring the Somali federal government to admit they were civilians. The fellow farmers who survived were pressuring them to do the same because they were being told that they were, al-Shabaab militants, where they are not. So again, that's never happened, and I cannot see any reason why al-Shabaab would bring their own militants to Mogadishu, or why hundreds of people would protest this. It's become, I think, very clear in Somalia that these people are civilians, which is why the AFRICOM statement saying that their investigation found that they were enemy armed combatants, and note they don't say al-Shabaab, they say enemy armed combatants, is really troubling. To me, that makes me think that perhaps, it's again this kind of cover-up of saying no, these people were firing back at us, which they're simply, in the course of my investigation, is not the case.
And finally, Christina, I want to ask you about the bombing that took place 2 months later, almost 2 months later, when now the numbers have been adjusted to over 500 people killed in the twin bomb blasts in Mogadishu October 14th. Can you talk about, is there any link between these two?
There isn't a link between these two. There was an article that came out in the aftermath of that bombing that alleged that one of the suicide bombers was somebody who had been radicalized after that operation. What happened is that about a month after the incident where the farmers were killed, al-Shabaab went to the town nearby, which the Somali National Army soldiers were attempting to hold from them, and retook the town, killing about 40 Somali National Army soldiers in the course of that. And after that happened, which was at the end of September, that entire area now is yet again in the hands of al-Shabaab. So it's possible that the suicide bomber came from that area, but if so, it's only because al-Shabaab retook the town nearby and perhaps sent one of their militants from that town to Mogadishu to carry out that tragic bombing.
Christina Goldbaum, I want to thank you for being with us. Last question, what directly has the Pentagon told you in your reporting on both the massacre and what you're alleging is a U.S. Pentagon cover-up?
I spoke to them a day before my article came out, and they had told me that the investigation was still ongoing. So to me, it's very suspicious that 30 minutes after my article is published, that they have come out to say that the investigation has finished and that they have found that they were not civilians who were killed. So again, that was 24 hours before this article came out, and the DOD was telling me that the investigation was still ongoing. It was undergoing a credibility assessment then.
Christina Goldbaum, thank you so much for your incredible reporting. Independent journalist based in Mogadishu. Her new article for the Daily Beast is headlined, "Strong Evidence U.S. Special Operations Forces Massacred Civilians in Somalia." We'll link to it. We'll link to the Daily Beast piece at DemocracyNow.org. Christina was joining us today from Nairobi, Kenya. And we end today's show with an update on efforts to impeach President Donald Trump. In November, a half-dozen Democrats introduced articles of impeachment against Trump, accusing him of obstruction of justice and other offenses. For more, we're joined here in New York by constitutional attorney John Boniface, co-founder and director of Free Speech for People. Welcome back to Democracy Now! John, what's happening?
Well, there's significant momentum growing at the grassroots level, and as you say, among those members of Congress who stood up and introduced those articles of impeachment. Now, 17 communities on record all across the country calling for impeachment proceedings to begin against this president. Millions of Americans signing petitions, including ours at impeachdonaldtrumpnow.org. This campaign is designed to protect the Constitution and our democracy in the face of what is a constitutional crisis, a president who's trampling on the rule of law.
Why impeach?
Well, the impeachment power is what we have as people under the Constitution to remove a lawless president. There is an investigation that Special Counsel Mueller is proceeding with, and that's a criminal investigation, whether or not the president or any of his associates have committed violations of federal criminal law. But there's a separate issue that also must go forward in parallel to that investigation. That's an impeachment investigation, whether the president has abused his power and abused the public trust. And now we have seen, both with the emoluments violations of the anti-corruption provisions of the Constitution, where the president is treating the Oval Office as a profit-making enterprise at the public expense, with obstruction of justice, with potential conspiracy to collude with the Russian government to interfere with our elections, with the abuse of the pardon power. The list goes on and on, Amy. And the fact is that this president must be held accountable under the law, and that's through the impeachment process.
Finally, Weston, Massachusetts, what happened?
Weston, Massachusetts, the most recent community to step forward via a town meeting and call for these impeachment proceedings to begin. There will be other communities that step forward. But I think what's important now is we as a people stand up to defend our Constitution, our democracy in the face of a president who so defies the rule of law.
Well, John Boniface, we're going to do part 2 of this discussion at DemocracyNow.org. People can find it in our web-exclusive section. John Boniface, constitutional attorney, co-founder and director of Free Speech for People. That does it for our broadcast. Democracy Now! Produced by Renee Feltz, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Masood, Trina Nandura, Amel Ahmed, Nat Needham, Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, Paul Huckabee, our engineer. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Julie Crosby, Hugh Brand, David Brood, Ariel Boone. I'm Amy Goodman. Our website is democracynow.org. Thanks for joining us.